Hello, everybody. My name is David Kulo. Edward Lint is a co-presenter here, and we'll describe ourselves a little bit in a few slides. I just wanted to go over quickly today the objectives in the agenda. So the first 5 minutes is some housekeeping introductions, and then Edward's going to take over and kind of go over pricing, why it's critical, how do you set pricing, and then he's going to pass a baton to me, and I'll talk a little bit about profit and cash flow, the difference and how pricing affects those, and then we'll wrap it up with some Q&A. Uh, so we look forward to your questions at that point in time. So next slide, please. So about Boston Business Mentors, we're a 501(c)(3) nonprofit that was founded in October of last year by members of SCORE's Boston executive team. And the reason it was split up is that we felt that we could, or the executive team felt that it could serve our Boston clients better by breaking off and developing Boston Business Mentors. So for those of you who are not familiar completely, we provide free mentoring as well as educational workshops, such as this pricing workshop and webinar, and then other related services to help local small business owners and entrepreneurs. So our mission, as it states there, is to work with clients individually to help them be successful and grow their business, to enable our clients and businesses to thrive in a highly dynamic, competitive marketplace. And then our values are really to empower all of you to create and sustain businesses and organizations, and to hopefully be able to give back and be willing to give back to your communities. And on a side note, I just want to say that um, starting and owning and running a small business is a lonely enterprise. I've been there, I've done that. It can create a lot of stress, a lot of sleepless nights, etc. It can affect your health, it can affect your relationships. And so we just want you to know that Boston Business Mentors is there to be with you in your journey so that you're not alone or are less alone. We're a resource. Please tap us on any number and any range of questions. The beauty of Boston Business Mentors is we have currently over 40 mentors, and each of us brings a little some tidbit or expertise, so we complement each other very well. So please ask any questions, anything you might need help with, etc. So next slide, please. So the ways that we can help, as the previous slide mentioned, mentoring. So please use the QR code if you're interested in connecting with a team of some of our mentors, and then workshops such as this, related topics and skill development, and then just information. So there's a whole library of content that Teresa has done a fabulous job of putting together. So that's on bbmentors.org, and look under resources. Okay. So your workshop hosts are myself and Edward. I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. Come from the consumer products background as well as investment banking. I've grown and exited multiple consumer products company. I've also imported products from Europe, Asia, other countries in North America. And prior to that, I was on the dark side. I was in investment banking. So my passions are, family, travel, and encouraging youth, particularly to get involved in the performing arts. And most of all, I just want to let you know, I have been there where you're at. I have scars on my back. I have the circles under my eyes are starting to heal now. So I know where you're at and some of the challenges that you face. And with that, I'm going to pass the baton to Edward, and he's going to introduce himself and then go through a number of the pricing slides.
Thanks, David. I appreciate that. Hey everyone, it's Edward. It's lovely to meet you all. Similar to David, I'm also a mentor at BBM, Boston Business Mentors. I currently run a consulting firm that helps small business owners with business acquisitions and exits. But prior to that, I also led the pricing team for a large financial technology company. And so, hoping to bring some of that experience and share with you some of the things that I learned about pricing, particularly um, in this webinar. Cool. So, as David mentioned at the start, I wanted to cover two broad topics before handing it back to him. The first is really about sort of pricing and what makes it so important, so critical for most businesses out there. Um, and then the second is really how you think about determining pricing. And the goal here is really to equip you with, some frameworks and some ways of thinking about how to set the quote unquote right level of pricing. Um, so I'll start with this first topic, which is, you know, why is pricing so important for almost every business? And I'd like to highlight on this page five things. The first is that pricing as a strategic lever is one of the easiest for small businesses to pull. Unlike, initiatives in sales or updating your marketing or developing a new product, pricing requires very little in terms of investment or new people or new systems. It mostly requires that you sort of understand your customer and your product and do a bit of homework, which we'll talk about. But again, is one of the simplest things that you can do to improve revenue and profitability. The second thing that I'll highlight here is that pricing helps you lose the wrong customers. And so, as small business owners, I'm sure a lot of you guys can relate to this idea that it is often your least profitable customers that tend to be the most price sensitive. And so, raising pricing or adjusting your pricing is can be thought of as a relatively inoffensive way to allow these customers to almost self-select out so that you have a smaller book of higher value customers. Um, the third point on this page is that customers probably care less about pricing than you think. Now, obviously, that is a broad generalization, and we'll talk about the situations where that is more and less true. But in general, a lot of the times you'll find that customers use your product or service for things other than pricing. So that might be, related to reliability, it might be related to speed, trust, convenience, or any other number of factors that aren't price related. And so, if customers really perceive the value and the quality of your product, it can often be the case that reasonable price increases don't really have a huge impact on the number of customers you have or the volume that you're selling. And then the last 2 points here, I want to go through a bit more of a worked example, but I'll cover very quickly right now. The first is that the math can often be on your side with pricing increases. So a pricing increase will only really hurt your business if the volume that you're selling falls by more than the increase. And so, as a quick example, raising prices by 10% will increase your revenue unless your volume drops by more than 9%. And again, we'll go through some specific examples just to nail this point a little bit better. But just know that the math can often be on your side. And then the last point I want to touch on this page is that pricing unlocks what's called operating leverage. And so what I mean by that is that if you are a business with any fixed costs or a lot of fixed costs, every dollar of pricing increase actually has a very high margin. And so what pricing does is it allows your profit to scale much faster than your revenue. Again, I know that some of this might not make sense, but hopefully as we go through a worked example, it'll become a little bit clearer. Um, I'll pause there for just 1 second and say, Teresa, that if we want to make this a more interactive conversation, I think David and I are happy to take questions as we go through as well. I know we have Q&A at the end, but I'll sort of leave it to you to moderate that.
Yeah, if anyone puts anything to chat, I'm happy to field that and to you guys. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Um, so before I jump into a specific worked example, I wanted to give a bit of a framework or a breakdown of what profit looks like for almost any business, right? So this is relevant whether you're a product business and you're selling t-shirts or you're a service business and you do consulting and things like that. But profit as a whole can be thought of as a function of your business's revenue, the business's cost of sales or direct costs, and then your other operating costs or overheads. Um, and then if you look on the very right-hand side, you can see that sort of revenue can be thought of as a function of price and volume. Obviously, we're going to talk about these things as we go through the example. Your cost of sales is really things like, raw materials and other direct costs. So you might have manufacturing costs, direct labor costs, etc. And then your operating costs in general can be thought of as your fixed costs and your variable costs. So fixed costs are things that do not sort of change with the amount of volume or activity that your business sees. Um, a very common example of that might be rent. And then your variable costs are obviously the opposite of that, where the more your business does, the more these things cost. Um, so that's just kind of a general breakdown. But I wanted to jump into a specific example just to illustrate the power of pricing and the impact that it can have on the bottom line. And so let's consider a company fictitious, obviously called Acme. Um, and what Acme does is it sells t-shirts online for about $20 a shirt. It costs Acme about $10 a shirt to produce. And the only other cost apart from that $10 per shirt is the owner, Jen's salary. So Jen will pay herself a $65,000 salary from the business. Apart from those, there are no other expenses that are relevant. And so if we think about Acme, what I wanted to do was illustrate kind of what the impact on the bottom line and the top line were in different pricing scenarios. So if we think about Acme today, and we assume that Jen is currently selling about 10,000 shirts at $20 a shirt, Jen is bringing in revenue of $200,000. She has a cost of sales of $100,000, which was that $10 per shirt that it cost to produce multiplied by 10,000 shirts, which leaves her with a gross profit of $100,000. And then, as I mentioned, Jen pays herself a salary of $65,000, which leaves her business with a profit of $35,000 at the end of the day. $35,000 divided by $200,000 of revenue gives her about an 18% profit margin. And so that's what Jen's business looks like in the status quo or today. Um, and so the next two columns, which I'll walk through, are sort of examples of what her P&L will look like if she implements pricing increases. Sorry, I thought I saw a question there.
I can use my cost model as an example, but what about my cost point versus competitors? What advice do you have a startup service provider?
Yes, so we'll get into that in a second. But let me just finish off this example. And again, the point here is really just to illustrate that the impact that pricing can have. Um, and so in the second column, let's assume that Jen increases her price by 25%, right? So instead of selling t-shirts for $20, she's now selling them for $25 each. And so obviously she's going to bring in more revenue now if she still sells 10,000 t-shirts. Her revenue is now $250,000. Her cost of sales is still the same because she's still producing 10,000 shirts at $10 a shirt, and her salary is still the same because she's still paying herself the same $65,000. But what you can see is that her bottom line has increased significantly, right? It's gone from $35,000 to $85,000. And so it's obviously more than doubled. And her profit margin has also almost doubled. It's gone from 18% to 34%. Now, the obvious point here is that there are very few businesses where you would increase your price by 25% and not see any impact on sort of volume. Um, and so in the third column, we sort of discussed that a little bit, where let's assume now that Jen has increased her price per t-shirt from $20 to $25 as before. But because these shirts are more expensive, she loses about 15% of her customers. So previously she was selling 10,000 t-shirts. Now she's only selling 8,500, right? So a 15% decrease. And so what you can see is that what happens is that Jen produces a little bit more revenue. So she's now selling, $212,500 of t-shirts. But her cost of sales has gone down a little bit because she's selling fewer t-shirts, right? It's now $10 times 8,500 t-shirts. And so her cost of sales is $8,500, as opposed to the $100,000 that it used to be. Um, and because she pays herself the same salary, what ends up happening at the end of the day is that even though she lost about 15% of her customers, her profit has increased by just under 30,000, right? It used to be $35,000. It's now $62,500, and her profit margin has increased from 18% to 29%. And so I guess I just wanted to use this example to illustrate um, why pricing is so powerful, even if you lose some of your customers, right? And so, again, we're not saying that this is going to happen all the time, nor are we advocating that you should blindly increase your pricing. It's just the point to say that pricing can be a very powerful lever to improve your business's profitability. And then to that point, you know, obviously different businesses will have different abilities to price their products or services. Um, you can think of sort of two factors that really determine the ability of your business to extract value from pricing. The first is the perceived necessity of the product. And so as you go left to right on the screen, you move from sort of low necessity, so things like designer bags, custom made products, which are really discretionary in nature, through to high necessity products, so things like prescription medicine, rent, utilities, etc., which are tend to be less discretionary in nature. The second factor you might think about is the availability of substitutes. So as you go from bottom to top of the page, you go from low substitutes to high substitutes. So in the high substitute category, you can think of things like snack products, right? Um, you know, if your snack provider raises their prices, there are any number of other snacks that you could purchase, which means that there are lots of substitutes available for that. On the other hand, again, if you go to the bottom, those are things that tend to be sort of less substitutable. So designer bags, prescription medicines, etc. And so in general, as you move to the right and the bottom of the page, you tend to have more pricing power. And then as you move to the left and the top of the page, you tend to have lower pricing power. And so one of the things that I would consider or encourage you to consider in your businesses is sort of where you fall on this matrix to determine the extent to which pricing is going to be a very effective lever for you. Cool. Now, I think this goes to the sort of question that was raised before, but it's sort of like, how do we think about pricing, right? And this is kind of the second part of what I wanted to talk about. Um, Broadly speaking, there are three kind of ways to think about how you might price something. The first is cost plus, the second is peer pricing, and then the third is value based. Um, Cost plus really thinks about sort of how much it costs you to produce a product and therefore how much you want to charge for it. And so an example of that might be it costs me $50 to produce this cake. I'd like to charge $60 for it because I want $10 of profit per cake. And so that's cost plus. It's really about sort of the marginal cost of production plus a profit margin. Um, in the middle, you have peer pricing, which is, goes to the question earlier, which is really about how much competitors are charging. And so it might be the case that, you're a home services business and all your competitors charge $60 for a basic service. And so you want to charge about the same amount. So peer pricing is really about, looking at what other people are charging and aligning your pricing to that. And then the third on the right is really about the value you provide. It's value-based pricing, right? So you know that your customers will extract $100 of value from your product or service, and then you split that with them. So you'll take 60 of that 100. So it's about capturing some of the incremental value that you give to your customers. Um, the important thing that I would note here is that these three methods are not mutually exclusive. So it's not that you sort of pick one and go with that. You're not sort of saying, um, you know, I'm purely a cost plus sort of pricing business, or I'm purely a value-based pricing business. It's always important to sort of think about all three holistically. Um, and on the next page, I'll discuss sort of when you might overweight one of these methods versus another. But again, it's really critical to understand that, you know, you don't just choose one of these, right? You think about all three holistically. And so, you know, when should you use each of these pricing methods? I think there are a few ways or a few factors in the business um, that can help you determine this, right? And so the factors that I typically think about are differentiation, the level of competition, the comparability, and the switching costs. So on differentiation, you know, if you are in a business that sells a relatively commoditized product, um, you would tend to lean more towards cost plus. And then if you're in the opposite, so you sell a highly differentiated product, things like luxury goods, you tend to be on the value-based side, right? And I think you sort of see a lot of this play out in real, in practice. When you think about sort of Chanel or a luxury bag producer, they're really not thinking about how much it costs them to produce the bag. They're thinking about how much value people extract from having one of their bags and then pricing based on that, right? So the cost of producing a Chanel bag is nowhere near the cost that it retails for example. The second factor that you might think about is competition. And so on the left side, if you have high degree of competition, so in a business like a restaurant where, your customer could either go to you or go to any other number of competitors on the same street, you might think about leaning more towards on the cost plus side. Whereas, on the right-hand side where you have very little competition, so if you think about businesses like Google Ads or Facebook ads, they can really price based on the value that they're bringing their customers as opposed to thinking about what other people are charging for it. Um, the third point that you might think about is comparability. So, the greater the extent to which you can compare across products, the more likely it is that you should be leaning towards cost plus. And so, one example of that is flights, right? Because flights in general, while there are better carriers and worse carriers and better service and worse service, what they're really selling is getting you from point A to point B. And so it's very easy to compare sort of the price across one airline versus another because you know exactly what you're getting in either scenario. Uh, the more true that is, the more likely you are to lean towards cost plus pricing. And the less true that is, the more likely you are to lean towards value based pricing. And so you can think of something like a legal firm where it's really hard for a law firm's client to know, you know, which firm is better for a specific type of matter versus another firm. And because of that, law firms can typically charge closer to value-based pricing than cost plus. Um, and then finally, I'll talk a little bit about switching costs, where it's really about how difficult it is for you to defect to another provider. And so we talked about snacks before, right? Where the switching cost is almost zero because it doesn't really cost you anything to buy a different snack from a different provider versus the one that you usually go to. Um, where the switching costs tend to be low, you would tend to lean towards cost plus. Where switching costs are really high, so you can think about sort of accounting software or ERP systems where it's really hard to rip out the software and replace it because your whole business runs on it. You tend to lean towards value-based pricing a little bit more. Um, and so my point on this page is it's really a spectrum, and it kind of depends on where your business sits across each of these different parameters. And then, on the left-hand side, you've got leaning towards cost plus. On the right-hand side, you've got leaning towards value-based. And then in the middle, you're sort of thinking more about peer pricing and things like that. Um, but depending on your specific type of business, um, you would look at these factors and you would determine which kind of method that you want to determine your pricing using. Um, The final thing I will add on the sort of question of how should I set my pricing is actually what is the lowest price that I should set for my pricing? Um, and in general, the answer to this question will be, you should never set the price lower than your marginal cost of production. And so, in the example we gave earlier with Acme and Jen's t-shirt company, the marginal cost of production was about $10 per shirt. And so, if Jen wanted to be profitable, she should not be setting the price anywhere below $10 per shirt. The only caveat I will make to that is that there are certain situations where you would be willing to lose money on one product to make money on others, right? And so perhaps Costco is a really good example of that, where the hot dogs and the food items that you see outside the store are typically loss making for the business, but they believe that by providing these products, they're going to attract more customers who go in and then buy products which are profitable for them. So that's the only kind of caveat that I'd give there. And yeah, I guess with that, that's sort of the two topics that I wanted to touch on. Again, happy to take questions after this during the Q&A part. But I'll hand back over to David, who will talk a little bit about pricing, profitability, and cash flow and how you might think about that.
Thank you, Edward. So in this portion, we want to discuss the profit versus cash flow impact on the business and how it relates to pricing. So you're all probably familiar with profit and cash flow. So to kind of give an analogy, profit is the overall health of the business, whereas cash flow is really the lifeblood of the business. So if you're bleeding cash, that's going to affect your overall health of the business. And the reason for that we're bringing this up is there are two types of decision making in business generally. Number one is cash flow decision making, where you're basing decisions on how much cash you have. And that generally is how small businesses operate. And then once you get above a certain size where cash, you have enough in the bank, you're large enough so that you're covering all your fixed costs or critical mass, then you can switch to what's known as net present value decision making, which is, hey, I have enough cash to make a certain number of investments. I have a range of, say, a half a dozen investments that I want to make. I have the cash to do some of them. Which is going to generate the greatest return on that investment. So you're less worried about the cash because you're already profitable and you have the cash. Whereas early, you need to be sure that you have the cash. And so that all affects and relates back to the pricing that you choose, regardless of whether you're a product like Acme or you're a service like a landscaper or other. So just very quickly, I know we're going back to kind of basics here, but profit is basically the financial gain or loss after expenses are subtracted from the sales or revenue that you get. Okay. And that revenue is when you book it, not necessarily when you receive payment for it. Whereas cash flow relates directly to the cash that you receive and when you pay out. So it's the amount and timing of the money coming into the business or going out of the business. So obviously, in a simplistic world, having more money coming in to pay bills when they're due is better. Okay. But it's really important because the differences are critical. So cash flow is crucial for day-to-day operations of the business, ensuring that your bills, your loans, et cetera, can be paid, whereas profit can be positive, yet cash flow can be negative. It's important to really understand that. Next slide, please. So you can be priced for profit, yet still have negative cash flow. So in those aspects, here are some examples. So, let's use Jen and Acme as a good example. It's really important when Jen gets paid. So you could have large customers, whether Jen is lucky that Acme all of a sudden sells into Walmart or Target. Well, they negotiate because of their size and power that they don't pay Jen for her t-shirts that they order and receive for like 60 or 90 days. Whereas Jen may have a supplier, a t-shirt supplier, that she has to give a deposit 60 days before she gets delivery and then has to pay the balance on the t-shirts before they'll deliver them. So she has to outlay that cash before she ships them to Walmart or Target or other customers. And so she has to float that cash during that time. Other times, and you are familiar with this, sometimes customers or suppliers will give you terms. So you have to pay them, they'll ship it to you, but you pay them in 30 days. Well, that still may be earlier than when you get the money coming in. And you're all familiar with such things as, layaways or, pay a month, pay monthly. Home Depot does this quite a bit on larger appliance purchases where you order it, but you only have to pay a certain amount each month over 18 months. So it's really important to understand and make sure that you have enough cash if you are delayed in getting paid. Other times you can have a large customer and they may all of a sudden stop paying you because they're in financial difficulties. So those are important considerations because that affects the blood flow of your business. Another aspect where you can be profitable but have negative cash flow is, for example, if you have loans. So you've taken on some loans and invested in, say, equipment or something else like that. So say you're a service and you a landscaping business. So you have landscaping, lawnmowers, or say you're a snowplow business in wintertime. You have to buy a truck and the plow to go ahead of that. Well, those are capital investments that you pay up front or might take a loan for. And you, over time, have to pay that loan back. But that principal payment, not the interest, but the principal, those are not expenses against the profit that you generate. So that's another example of where you're paying cash out and it affects your cash flow, but not necessarily your profit. Another example, and this is more on the product side, on the Acme example, is say you buy a lot of inventory, and that could be for a number of reasons. One is, you want to buy a lot because the supplier gives you a price discount, which helps your pricing and your profit in Edward's examples, but you don't sell enough quickly enough before you then have to pay your supplier. So those are another example, overstocking of products. So maybe you buy a bunch of product thinking that it's going to sell through quickly, but unfortunately, due to all of a sudden competition or other aspects, such as that the supplier has a high minimum number of units that you have to buy of Acme's t-shirts in order to get them to ship it to you. So you're carrying inventory over time where you have to pay it before you sell it. And the last example in kind of carrying too much inventory are seasonal sales. So, for example, in a product company, Jen and Acme may sell a lot of t-shirts in the summertime, but then the sales dry up in the wintertime because people are wearing heavier clothes. So even though she's priced profitably, they're carrying that inventory over that fall, winter, and early spring time. So again, the seasonal company can be priced profitably, but you have to make sure as you look at your business, if there are seasonalities involved, that you can cover your fixed cost, your payroll, your rent, your insurance, your legal services, etc., over that slower period. And that can be done by putting money aside and kind of having and building a cash reserve or getting seasonal bridge loans where they're 6 months, 9 months, so you can buy your t-shirt inventory going into the next spring, summer, but then have to pay that back. So I hope that kind of gives you a little bit of an indication and the difference and why cash flow is important as you're pricing and setting up other things such as terms for your customers and terms with suppliers that can affect your profitability and cash flow. Next slide, please. So here are the key takeaways from Edward and the cash flow portion that I just gave. Pricing is a powerful lever to improve your business's profitability, particularly if demand for your product or service is inelastic. In other words, inelastic means that that you can charge a higher price, and as Edward said, your volume sales don't decrease significantly. And then there are the three basic or broadly known or used pricing strategies: cost plus, peer pricing, and value-based. And Edward's charts that he had in those slides, I think, are very good examples of those. And so, as Edward said, they're not mutually exclusive, and you should consider all three when you're viewing your business's pricing, and also constantly review them because the competitive landscape may change, and all of a sudden you might be able to move or use a different pricing model than you had earlier. So again, this goes back to the competition of your industry. And the more competition you have, you may have to graduate towards that cost plus pricing. And then last, in terms of key takeaways, is pricing isn't just about profit. You should really understand the cash flow implications of your pricing and how you may need to price things to generate the cash to pay your fixed costs or your suppliers. So with that, we want to thank you and open it up for questions for Q&A. And we hope you have some good questions. And again, please ask anything, even if we haven't touched on it.
Great. Thank you. And I will give everyone a chance if anyone has a question to type that in now. As we start to wrap it up, just a reminder that both of these gentlemen are volunteers with Boston Business Mentors and do see clients on an active basis. So if you'd like to meet with them or any of our other mentors, reach out to us. You can use the QR code to request a mentor there, or if you just want to email me, I'll make sure you get connected as well. And that email address is connect@bbmentors.org. So I am not seeing any questions. So we will be sending out a follow-up email with the recording. All right, we have a question. What about this example? Home-based business for Italian baked goods, value, cost, but also value being unique.
Edward, do you want to handle that? And I'll handle some color commentary on that at the end.
Yeah, for sure. Sorry, before that, Teresa, I believe there was a question sort of partway through the presentation. Did we address that?
Yes, he said you did.
Okay, perfect. So it sounds like the question here is for a specific business, which is a home-based Italian goods business. What sort of cost pricing model should they lean towards, right? And so again, the way that I would think about this is kind of um, if you look at the business based on these things, right? Where would you fall upon that, right? So I'm not exactly sure what type of business you are and sort of how many competitors there are in the space. But if, to your point, there's nothing out there in the market, then you should really think about sort of how much are people willing to pay for it as opposed to how much it costs you, right? So because you're saying, it's a pretty unique product. There's nothing really else out there. It means that you're pretty differentiated. You have low competition. There's not really anything to compare to. And your switching costs might be sort of low, but on average, you would probably be leaning towards the sort of right-hand side of this. Does that make sense?
And I'd like to add to what Edward's saying and build upon it. So it's really about, as he was saying, the differentiation and the value proposition. Uh, you need to be to have an easily communicated differentiation or value proposition so that the customer as she or he looks at your cookie versus other cookies that are out there, understands why yours is better and why they should pay a higher price for it or maybe even a lower price for it. And with a cookie, as with many foods, it's really about taste. Is it about nutritional profile? Is it also about what does your brand or your company stand for? And is that something that a consumer can get behind? What are your values? What is your mission of your company or brand and the cookie? So those are some differentiating factors that as you're looking at doing your marketing, you want to be able to communicate those easily. So I hope those are helpful.
Great. Okay. Well, I don't see any other questions. And certainly, if you think of a question later, you can just send me an email and I can connect you to the presenters. We'll also include information in the follow-up email that I mentioned. So definitely do not hesitate to reach out should you have any other questions. So thank you for joining us. We hope to see you again on a future webinar. And thank you, Edward and David, for all your shared knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you
Thank you,
everyone for your
Teresa.
time.
Thanks, everyone.